Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies. And this is Ancient Masons from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. Ancient Masons. Ancients was the name assumed by the schismatic body of Masons who, in 1738, seceded from the regular Grand Lodge of England, and who at the same time insultingly bestowed upon the adherents of that body the title of moderns. Thus Dermot, and his Reason, divides the Masons of England into two classes as follows. The ancients under the name of free and accepted Masons according to the old institutions. The moderns under the name of Freemasons of England, and though a similarity of names, yet they differ exceedingly in making, ceremonies, knowledge, Masonic language, and installations. So much that they always have been, and still continue to be, two distinct societies, totally independent of each other. To understand, therefore, anything of the meaning of these two terms, we must be acquainted with the history of the schism of the self-styled ancients from the legal Grand Lodge of England. No Masonic student should be ignorant of this history, and I propose, therefore, to give a brief sketch of it in the present article. In the year 1738, a number of brethren in London, having become dissatisfied with certain transactions in the Grand Lodge of England, separated themselves from the regular lodges and began to hold meetings and initiate candidates without the sanction and authority of the Grand Lodge. Preston, who has given a good account of the schism, does not, however, state the causes which led to the dissatisfaction of the recusant brethren, but Thorey attributes it to the fact that the Grand Lodge had introduced some innovations, altering the rituals and suppressing many of the ceremonies which had long been in use. This is also the charge made by Dermot. It is certain that changes were made, especially in some of the modes of recognition, and these changes, it is believed, were induced by the publication of a spurious revelation by the notorious Samuel Pritchard. Preston himself acknowledges that innovations took place, although he attributes them to a time subsequent to the first succession. Just about this time, some dissensions had occurred between the Grand Lodge at London and that at York, and the succeeding brethren, taking advantage of this condition of affairs, assumed, but without authority from the Grand Lodge of York, the name of Ancient York Masons. Matters were, however, subsequently accommodated, but in the next year, the difficulties were renewed, and the Grand Lodge persisting in its innovations and ritualistic changes. The succeeding brethren declared themselves independent and assumed the appellation of Ancient Masons to indicate their adherence to the ancient forms, while, for a similar purpose, they denominated the members of the regular lodges Modern Masons, because, as was contended, they had adopted new forms and usages. The succeeders established a new lodge in London, and, under the claim that they were governed by the ancient York constitutions, which had been adopted at that city in the year 926, they gained over many influential persons in England, and were even recognized by the Grand Lodges of Scotland and Ireland. The ancient York lodges, as they were called, greatly increased in England, and became so popular in America that a majority of the lodges and provincial Grand Lodges established in this country during the 18th century derived their warrants from the Grand Lodges of Ancient York Masons. In the year 1756, Lawrence Dermot, then Grand Secretary and subsequently the Deputy Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, published a book of constitutions for the use of the Ancient Masons under the title of Reason, which work went through several editions, and because the code of Masonic law for all who adhered, either in England or America, to the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, while the Grand Lodge of the Moderns or the regular Grand Lodge of England and its adherents were governed by the regulations contained in Anderson's constitutions, the first edition of which had been published in 1723. The dissension between the two Grand Lodges of England lasted until the year 1813, when, as will be hereafter seen, the two bodies became consolidated under the name and title of the United Grand Lodge of Ancient Freemasons of England. 4 years afterward, a similar and final reconciliation took place in America by the union of the two Grand Lodges in South Carolina. At this day, all distinction between the ancients and moderns had ceased, and it lives only in the memory of the Masonic student. What were the precise differences in the rituals of the ancients and the moderns? It is now perhaps impossible to discover, as from their esoteric nature they were only orally communicated, but some shrewd and near approximations to their real nature may be drawn by inference from the casual experiences which have fallen from the advocates of each in the course of their long and generally bitter controversies. It has been said that the regular Grand Lodge is stated to have made certain changes in the modes of recognition in consequence of the publication of Samuel Pritchard's spurious revelation. These changes were, as we traditionally learn, a simple transposition of certain words, by which that which had originally been the first became the second, and that which had been the second became the first. Hence, Dr. Delcho, the compiler of the original Amen Reason of South Carolina, who was himself made in an ancient lodge, but was acquainted with both systems, says, the real difference in point of importance was no greater than it would be to dispute whether the gloves should be placed first upon the right or on the left. A similar testimony as to the character of these changes is furnished by an address to the Duke of Apple, the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, in which it is said, I would beg leave to ask whether two persons standing in the Guild Hall of London, the one facing the statues of Gog and Magog, and the other with his back turned on them, could, with any degree of propriety, quarrel about their stations, as Gog must be on the right of one and Magog on the right of the other. Such then, and far more insignificant, is the disputatious temper of the succeeding brethren, that on no better grounds than the above they choose to usurp a power and to aid in open and direct violation of the regulations they had solemnly engaged to maintain, and by every artifice possible to be devised endeavored to increase their number. It was undoubtedly to the relative situation of the pillars of the porch, and the appropriation of their names in the ritual, that these innuendos referred. As we have them now, they were made by the change effected by the Grand Lodge of Moderns, which transposed the original order in which they existed before the change, and in which order they are still preserved by the continental lodges of Europe. It is then admitted that the moderns did make innovations in the ritual, and although Preston asserts that the changes were made by the regular Grand Lodge to distinguish its members from those made by the ancient lodges, it is evident from the language of the address just quoted that the innovations were the cause and not the effect of the schism. And the inferential evidence is that the changes were made in consequence of, and as a safeguard against, spurious publications, and were intended, as has already been stated, to distinguish impostors from true Masons, and not schismatic or irregular brethren from those who were orthodox and regular. But outside and beyond this transposition of words, there was another difference existing between the ancients and the moderns. Delcho, who was acquainted with both systems, says that the ancient Masons were in possession of marks of recognition known only to themselves. His language on this subject is positive. The ancient York Masons, he says, were certainly in possession of the original universal marks as they were known and given in the lodges they had left, and which had descended through the Lodge of York, and that of England down to their day. Besides these, we find they had peculiar marks of their own, which were unknown to the body from which they had separated, and were known to the rest of the Masonic world. We have, then, the evidence that they had two sets of marks, viz., those which they had brought with them from the original body, and those which they had, we must suppose, themselves devised. Dermot, in his Amen Reason, confirms this statement of Delcho, if indeed it needs confirmation. He says that a modern Mason may with safety communicate all his secrets to the ancient Mason, but that an ancient Mason cannot, with like safety, communicate all his secrets to a modern Mason without further ceremony, And he assigns as a reason for this, that as a science comprehends an art, though an art cannot comprehend a science, even so ancient masonry contains everything valuable among the moderns, as well as many other things that cannot be revealed without additional ceremonies. Now, what were these other things known by the ancients and not known by the moderns? What were these distinctive marks which precluded the latter from visiting the lodges of the former? Written history is of course silent as to these esoteric matters, but tradition confirmed by and at the same time explaining the hints and casual intimations of contemporary writers leads us to an almost irresistible inference that they were to be found in the different constructions of the third or master's degree and the introduction into it of the royal arch element. For, as Dr. Oliver says, the division of the third degree and the fabrication of the English royal arch appear, on their own showing, to have been the work of the ancients, and hence the Grand Secretary of the regular Grand Lodge, or that of the moderns, replying to the application of an ancient Mason from Ireland for relief, says, "Our society, i.e. the moderns, is neither arch, royal arch, nor ancient, so that you have no right to partake of our charity. This, then, is the solution of the difficulty. The ancients, besides preserving the regular order of the words in the first and second degrees, which the moderns had transposed, a transposition which had been retained in the lodges of Britain and America, but which has never been observed by the continental lodges of Europe, who continue the usage of the ancients, also finished the otherwise imperfect third degree with its natural complement, the royal arch, a complement with which the moderns were unacquainted, or which they, if they knew it once, had lost. For some years, the ancient lodges appeared to have worked on an independent system, claiming the original right which every body of Masons had to assemble and work without a warrant. Here, however, they were evidently in error, for it was well known that on the revival of Masonry in the year 1717, this right had been relinquished by the 4 London lodges that were then in operation, and which constituted the Grand Lodge. This objection the ancients pretended to meet by declaring that the Grand Lodge organized in 1717 was not legally constituted, only 4 lodges having been engaged in the organization, while, as they said, 5 were required. Here again they were in error, as there is no evidence of any such regulation having ever existed, and therefore, to place themselves in a less irregular position, they organized in 1757 a Grand Lodge of their own, which was subsequently known by the title of the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons of England according to the old constitutions, while the regular body was known as the Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons under the Constitution of England. The following is a list of the Grand Masters of the Grand Lodge of Ancients, from its organization to its dissolution. 1753, Robert Turner. 1754 through 1755, Edward Vaughan. 1756 through 1759, Earl of Blessington. 1760 through 1765, Earl of Kelly. 1766 through 1770, the Honorable Thomas Matthew. 1771 through 1774, 3rd Duke of Athol. 1775 through 1781, 4th Duke of Athol. 1782 through 1790, Earl of Antrim. 1791 through 1813, 4th Duke of Athol. 1813, Duke of Kent, under whom the reconciliation of the 2 Grand Lodges was accomplished. The Grand Lodge of the Ancient Masons was, shortly after its organization, recognized by the Grand Lodges of Scotland and Ireland, and though the ability and energy of its officers, but especially Lawrence Dermont, at one time its Grand Secretary, and afterwards its Deputy Grand Master, and the author of its Amen Reason, or Book of Constitutions, it extended its influence and authority into foreign countries and into the British colonies of America, where it became exceedingly popular and where it organized several provincial Grand Lodges. as, for instance, in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and South Carolina, where the lodges working under this authority were generally known as Ancient York Lodges. In consequence of this, dissensions existed not only in the mother country, but also in America for many years between the lodges which derived their warrants from the Grand Lodge of Ancients and those which derived theirs from the regular or so-called Grand Lodge of Moderns. But the Duke of Kent, having been elected in 1813, the Grand Master of the Ancients, while his brother, the Duke of Sussex, was the Grand Master of the Moderns, a permanent reconciliation was effected between the rival bodies, and by mutual compromises the present United Lodge of Ancient Freemasons of England was established. Similar unions were consummated in America, the last being that of the two Grand Lodges of South Carolina in 1817. And the distinction between the ancients and the moderns was forever abolished, or remains only as a melancholy page in the history of Masonic controversies. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.